coming. Welcome to the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. I'm Tracy Matthews. I'm the Associate Director here. And I want to welcome you all to CRESTalks. How many people have been to a CRESTalks event before? Oh, good. So CRES is Comparative Race and Ethnic Studies, which is the major and the minor that is operating out of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. And last year, we had some graduate student lecturers come to us and say, hey, what about inviting speakers to campus whose books we're teaching, or whose work we're looking at, the artists whose work we're looking at in our classes. And so that's how this lecture series was born. And so basically every year the center sponsors 6 graduate student lecturers to teach their own courses. And we ask them to suggest people that they'd like to bring to campus. And so today we have Sherwin Bryant, who was brought here by Tessa Murphy. And Tessa is teaching a course right now called Africans in the Early Americas. How many of you are in her class? Thank you for coming. So she included Sherwin Bryant's book, Rivers of Gold, Lives of Bondage, on her syllabus. And Tessa is a student in Caribbean and Latin American history, and she recently defended her dissertation, Imperial Imaginaries, Negotiated Realities, the Lesser Antilles, 1700 to 1795. So I'm going to let Tessa come and introduce Professor Bryant, and again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Tracy. We're very fortunate today to have Dr. Sherwin Bryant with us. Dr. Bryant is Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Northwestern University, where he teaches courses on Latin American history, the African diaspora, slavery, political economy, law, the Atlantic and Pacific worlds. And in his, I'm sure, ample free time, he's also Director of the Center for African American Studies. He earned his PhD in history at The Ohio State University, and he also studied history and education at North Carolina Central University. His research has been funded by the Fulbright Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Newberry Library here in Chicago, and the John Carter Brown Library, among others. Dr. Bryant is the co-author with Rachel O'Toole and Ben Vinson of a book called Expanding the Diaspora, Africans to Spanish America, and his second book, Rivers of Gold, Lives of Bondage, Governing Through Slavery in Colonial Quito, which several of us had the pleasure to read, was published in 2014. As I believe we'll be hearing more about today, the book shows that African slavery and colonial rule in this Spanish colony were mutually constitutive. So by controlling the importation, treatment, and status of enslaved people in this quite distant part of the Iberian Empire, the Spanish crown displayed its capacity and its claims to rule. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sherwin Bryant.
Tessa for that very generous and lovely introduction. First, I want to thank Sarah Tui, Dara Epson, Tessa Murphy, Carmen Firestone, Michael Dawson, and Tracy Matthews for both the generous invitation and all the work that went into putting together this talk. I thank them also for signing my book, and thanks to the students who had something to do with this. And all of those who've come out to engage in these ideas and themes that the work seeks to address. So I want to admit straight away that I'm doing a slight bit of a bait and switch today. So to put that differently, I like to make a slight adjustment to the title of the talk. So rather than policing the colonial slavery, race, and development of colonial law, it might be better entitled A View from Slavery, or Notes on Social Death versus Sociality, Race Governance versus Racial Identity, and the Meaning of Colonial Law. So the talk offers me an occasion, I think, to sort of reflect upon my work and the fields to which it purports to speak, and some sort of enduring sort of anxieties, questions, inquietudes that condition my ongoing work. As well as to showcase for me some of the ways in which scholars of colonial Latin America may be speaking past one another on the one hand and limiting ourselves conceptually on the other. The book is an attempt, as some of you know, to wrestle openly with a series of lingering questions, frustrations within the field, and my ongoing struggle to imagine the past while writing and exploring Black history, which is to say, the history of the modern world, or the emergence of Western modernity. And throughout the writing process, I've increasingly come to try and account for racial slavery's role in the constitution of colonial Latin America as a kind of starting point that privileges the lives and conditions of those deemed African, slave, Black, and indigenous. Since the book has come out, or as the book was coming out, I saw in sort of the study of slavery, certainly in terms of many of these popularized accounts of slavery, a kind of capitalist turn, a turn towards slavery as a kind of grounding or productive engine of capitalism, kind of, Williams' thesis, and increasing references at the same time of slavery and policing in scholarly and public discourse, right? So there's often this kind of return to that. And at the same time, within the historiography of colonial Latin America, I was starting to see a kind of what I want to sort of call a kind of governing turn. Sort of my word, Nancy Van Duzen's recent book, Global Indios, or even Joanne Rappaport's Disappearing Mestizo, which has a kind of governing outlook to it in terms of trying to make sense of governance. My book, Rivers of Gold, Lives of Bondage, Governing Through Slavery in Colonial Quito, sort of, marks off these enduring questions, but also, I think, the problem with bold subtitles. The problem with bold subtitles, Governing Through Slavery, is that this subtitle sort of suggests to you, or might allow some people to take it to mean, that slavery is the whole thing, that governing ultimately works if slavery is governed the way that colonial authorities imagined it to be or aspired it to work. And it tells the story of how slavery permeated colonial Quito, both the city and the countryside, throughout colonial times. Now, writing within a shifting political present, this was an attempt to write slavery into the master narrative of Ecuador, and to a lesser degree Southern Colombia, on the one hand, and to write Quito into the work of slavery, race, and diaspora on the other. Right? It was important to sort of do that because slavery had been largely disavowed in the sort of master narrative of Ecuadorian history and historiography for a very long time, even when it was very much sort of there in plain sight, both on the sort of walls of cathedrals and sort of immediately in the colonial archive, immediately in the documents, and certainly peppered throughout the colonial record. So the kinds of questions that both guided my inquiry, but also that sort of, I think, punctuated my inquiry into slavery went sort of like this. Was Quito a slave society or a society with slaves? How many enslaved people were there in Ecuador? What did they do? And this sort of, I think, comports with another sort of typical narration of the Black presence and slavery in Latin America. That is to say, there's a general sort of narrative that would suggest that Spanish exploration and conquest came, decimated indigenous populations, began a sort of an effort to settle colonized regions, and then ultimately ran into a kind of labor problem, and hence the need for enslaved Africans and the presence of enslaved Africans coming to the Americas. So there's a way in which the sort of presence of Africans in the Americas, especially in terms of colonial Spanish-American historiography, had been a kind of belated kind of beginning, right? A kind of afterthought, and largely threaded through a concern for labor, right? And so answering the question of whether or not Quito was a slave society or a society with slaves, for me, seemed to turn on this question of labor, right? Certainly the way that we think about slave societies or thought about slave societies up until this moment, hopefully, turned on the question of numbers and economic output, right? If enslaved captives predominated the labor forces, and if they predominated the economic engine of these colonies, then this colony might be considered at a certain scale a slave society. If they did not predominate, and if their economic outputs were not critical to the economic engine of a said colony, then it was said that this was merely a society with slaves. And that merely is sort of my addition to a kind of, Finley, Berlin kind of argument around slavery. But I think that it's an important sort of additive to the ways in which these definitions work, right? Because there's a way in which the importance of slavery is measured then almost always first through labor as productive labor, and secondly through economics, right? The actual sort of monetary output. And so when we talk about the extent to which slavery matters, it's ultimately sort of truncated then as being merely about numbers and economy rather than other concerns such as governance, law, and the construction of race. Right? Now, writing into this terrain, I was also writing into a terrain where race itself as a kind of category, as a concept, was ultimately disavowed primarily in the Andes. That is to say that if you read much of the literature on race coming out of the Andes, there's a way in which it's almost impossible to talk about race, right, in the Andes in particular. But then I would also say, later on top of that, the almost inability to talk about race prior to the 18th century, right? And so the question becomes, what is our definition of race, right? And what definition of race is circulating? What is it that's ultimately being, what is it that we're saying we cannot consider or talk about before the 18th century, right? And so I want to submit that we've reached a kind of echo chamber within the historiography of colonial Spanish America. On the one hand, we've talked about the ways in which race as a kind of category, as a kind of theme, as a construct, did not exist before the 18th century as related to biology and fixity. So that is to say that when people say you can or cannot invoke the term race, already sneaking into that discussion, or already sort of sneaking into that statement, is the presumption that we're talking about a kind of 19th century pseudoscientific, thoroughly biologized and predominantly concerned with fixity definition of race, right? That is to say that people are ultimately saying we can't use this biologized 19th century notion of race to talk about what's happening in the 19th century. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's also a concern with this question of fixity and mestizaje, right? The idea is that in Spanish America, there was so much mixture and movement between categories within what we might otherwise want to call a racialized hierarchy, that we also can't talk about race for that reason, right? Because of the fluidity, because of the movement, because these so-called casta categories did not ultimately determine how people self-identify or the possibilities of life, then therefore this is not race, right? And I think that some of this would be kind of summed up in a book by Douglas Cope, The Limits of Racial Domination, where Cope ultimately showed us that localized individuals usually define themselves and others, their neighbors, in very localized terms and ways, right? And it's only when there were before colonial authorities, courts, church officials, scribes, that they began to use the sort of colonial nomenclature that we consider to be sort of representative of the colonial racialized hierarchy, right? And so Cope then sort of showed us that ultimately, in terms of how people self-identify, there was a real sort of limitation in terms of this broader matrix of racial domination, right? And I think that therein lies the kind of problem or the rub within the field. On the one hand, we have, a kind of treatment of racial domination and its limitations. And on the other hand, we have a treatment of racial identification, right? And I think it's really important to distinguish between the two and to say that racial identification is not necessarily the same thing as talking about race, or what I have termed, drawn upon the theorist Martin Hesse, race governance, right? So what do I mean by that? And what is this distinction, right, between racial identification and race governance, right? It's important to make these two distinctions because what I want to do is is offer a useful, I think, definition for thinking about race as governance, right? And that is to see race as a colonial imposition for differentiated rule, right? It's a colonial imposition of differentiated rule, right? When the Spaniards arrive in the Americas, they bring in tow a kind of classificatory system and innovate it in the Americas, deeming indigenous people Indios and deeming people of African descent Negros, and also beginning to erect themselves and establish themselves as Españoles, right? And these sort of categories of human beings are now going to be governed in relationship to these imposed colonial markers and relationally, that is to say, in relationship to one another, right? And it's that sort of matrix of colonial governance that begins to inscribe race as a modality of differentiating people for different possibilities of life and rule under law. Now, this isn't so because it works out that way. This is not the case because it ultimately succeeds or because it convinces people to identify themselves exclusively in these categories. It's also not the case simply because people do things that the broader racial matrix would not like for them to do, right? This is not obliterated simply because of so-called miscegenation or because the colonial authorities find themselves having to innovate and elaborate this particular sort of classificatory scheme, right? This entire sort of matrix of innovating that classificatory scheme, the kind of meaning that people imbue with these terms, the ways in which they ally and evade these terms and their uses, all of that is still a broader part of what we're calling race governance or racial rule, right? So what I'm ultimately trying to point to are the ways in which I think scholarship, taking its cues from somebody like Cope and moving forward, has ultimately began to talk about racial identification as though it was the same thing as racial domination. That is to say, we've forgotten about sort of what Cope had in mind when he talked about the limits of racial domination. And because we've forgotten about those limits of racial domination, we failed to sort of understand race as a modality of governance that ultimately works in a way to sort of mark off and inscribe and elaborate colonial rule as a kind of differentiated modality of governing people. So for all of the mixing, for all of the mestizaje that we would find within colonial Latin American history, all of that mixture, or mestizaje, is actually occurring within that very same regime of colonial domination, right? It's happening within the regime of colonial racialized rule, right? No one's ultimately escaping that. They might move from one category to another, but the very possibility of seeing the mestizo disappear is actually because we're looking at the sort of gaze of the colonial authorities, and we're looking through the gaze of the colonial authorities, who are ultimately trying to inscribe people through these practices, right? And that's also an important point, because thinking about race as a mode of governance forces us to move away from racism, which has its own sort of history as a concept, which is a very recent history and a very recent concept. It allows us to move away from racism. It allows us to move away from questions of intent, right, which ultimately always come up in our conversations about racism today. And it forces, and it also allows us to move away from sort of Arendt and notions of race thinking, right? Moving away from a particular kind of biologized modality of thinking about people, or even sort of to move away from a sort of Barbara Fields kind of notion of ideology, to thinking about practices of racial violence, of racial domination, right? That is to say, we begin to see the ways that people are marked, surveilled, and compelled to identify themselves in relationship to this broader racial regime, right? That is to say that even if they evade or elide or hide from colonial authorities or resist taking up these particular monikers that have been assigned to them and inscribed upon their bodies, they're still doing so in relationship to a broader racial regime that's seeking to mark them, surveil them, police them, and rule them in very particular ways, right? It's also relationally occurring and beginning to create a fiction called, in Espanol, called whiteness or white normativity, right? These things are happening in relationship to one another, right? And so I would submit that this is an effort to begin to think through a kind of early modern history of race that predates and precedes, and perhaps even that ultimately makes possible these 18th and 19th century thoroughly biologized notions of race as a kind of ideology, right? And so then the question became, sort of what does slavery have to do with that, right? What does slavery have to do with this notion of race governance? Or what does slavery have to do with the production of race, right? So I want to put that to one side and so walk through a few other things and circle back to that particular question. Another theme or question that was ultimately sort of occasioning my thinking around all of this had to do with the importance of law. How important was the law, or what importance did the law assume in the lives of the enslaved, and how should it shape our understanding of slavery? Right? So, in the historiography of colonial Latin America, we know that enslaved people had certain legal possibilities, right? The question for me became, to some extent, sort of what ultimately occasioned those legal possibilities, right? And the more you look in the documents, the more you see that the very marker of esclavo was not simply a kind of economic or market-driven marker, but rather a juridical one. And that marker of enslaved subject of servitude repeats itself, or is repeated over and over again in sales records, in court cases, in disputes over enslaved subjects, in court cases that enslaved people themselves bring, right? Every time you see an enslaved person mentioned, you see their name, you see a kind of racialized description, right? And you see a phrase that roughly translates enslaved subject of servitude, right? And I submit that that's an actual sort of juridical marker that ultimately comes with, or has within it, a bundle of legal limitations, possibilities, and opportunities, and one or two rights, right? And I say that very much advisedly, right? Because the notion of enslaved people having rights is often a kind of oxymoron, right? That's why I think possibilities would be the sort of better way of thinking about this. So marking someone as an enslaved subject of servitude meant that this individual had certain possibilities under the law. And when we're talking about the law, we're talking about at this moment in time, so through the 18th century, we're talking about a moment before there's a strict notion of a sacred or a secular. We're talking about a moment when church and state are not necessarily disentangled, right? We're talking about an early modern Catholic order, right? And so law is both what we would now call religious as well as civil, right? And so this sort of marker allows enslaved people certain possibilities: marriage, the sacrament of marriage, baptism, right? As a kind of possibility. At the same time, certain possibilities to bring civil suits and to purchase their freedom, an opportunity to purchase freedom, and a whole range of other laws that seek to govern their movement and circulation within society. And in so doing, what the Crown and what the church ultimately does is they serve to reach into the domain of the patres familias or into the domain of patriarchs and slaveholders, right? That is to say that no longer is this property solely under the dominion of an enslaved vassal, but now that household of that vassal can be penetrated to some degree by the reach of the monarch and the church, if you will. That is to say that those people who own slaves cannot simply do whatever they will with those subjects. There's certain legal prescriptions and certain legal limitations within that. It doesn't mean that it's going to always work out. It doesn't mean that it's more benign. It doesn't mean that this is a kinder, gentler kind of slavery. It simply means that authority, rule, possession, dominion is actually so threaded through the social order that it ultimately serves to establish order within households. So there's a way in which the Crown now is not only going to govern issues and adjudicate issues related to slavery and slaveholding, but thereby govern and adjudicate issues related to slaveholders as well, right? So not just adjudicating matters pertaining to slaves, but now also adjudicating matters that might otherwise be argued to be the purview of the master or the master's domain, right? And so this is where I sort of arrived at this notion of governing through slavery. That is to say that disputes and concerns related to slavery and slaveholding are important to the Crown and to the church because these things mark off the domain of the Crown and the church, right? Not because they ultimately work out that way, not because enslaved people win, not because the emergence of the colonial state ultimately wins out or the empire wins out, but rather simply because this is how it worked. So what is the link between slavery and the development of race? And can we think about race prior to the 18th century? And in the book, I sort of point out, I use a number of what I consider to be sort of royal fonts that ultimately condition the life of enslaved subjects throughout the colonial empire. Branding, baptism, and the body as a kind of text or place of inscription. Right? In 1712, there's a visita de despacho, or a kind of review of the arrival of 166 enslaved African captives on the coast of Cartagena. And in this visita, or review, or royal inspection, it was one among many when slave ships arrived at any sort of established Spanish port. And in this document, you see a set of descriptions organized: men, women, children. And you see a range of descriptions of these individuals. One, their age, their gender, some indication of what my colleague Rachel O'Toole has called an Atlantic casta category. So whether they were Nukumi, whether they were Congo, etc. Right? And then also a bodily description. If they had smallpox scars, if they had been branded, if they had any sort of facial scarification, right? These things sort of outline this particular document. And rather than using this document in a sort of, in what was increasingly a kind of typical fashion of using this document as a kind of lens onto the sort of ethno-regional configuration of the enslaved Africans arriving, right? That is to say, trying to get a sense of the region that these enslaved Africans are from, with some sort of hints towards what people might think about as kind of ethnonyms or ethno-regional monikers. I certainly do that. But I began to see this documentation as a part of a broader set of practices of branding, baptizing, and ultimately marking enslaved people within ledgers and law as a modality of racial rule, of racial inscription, right? There's a way in which this document showcases the ways in which these bodies are both being read and inscribed by the sort of white gaze or racialized authorities on the coast of Cartagena. Right? That's what's happening in this document. Right? And it's a part of a broader set of practices that seeks to mark people in certain ways. And what's interesting about that is the fact that these particular ways of marking those individuals will follow them legally throughout the colonial record as they appear again and again and again, whether it's before a priest for baptism, whether it's later in a bill of sale down in Guayaquil, whether it's now in a court case, right? References will be made to their body, not as often in terms of scarification, but certainly the brands that they received, right? And all of this is a way of sort of both marking legal possibilities and limitations upon the bodies of these individuals, and also at the same time marking their sort of market value, right? So the market doesn't ultimately disappear in this sort of thinking around slavery, but it certainly is not the thing that's driving the way that we understand or that's driving the way that we sort of occasion the presence of African descended people every time we encounter them in the record, right? So thinking about branding, baptism, and this broader sort of system of marking bodies as a kind of initial act of racial inscription, without regard for whether or not people ultimately believe this now about themselves, right? That is not the point. But thinking about this as a practice of racial inscription and as a practice of racial governance, right? This is a sort of primary example of what I'm talking about when I'm thinking about race governance, right? Not just a kind of classificatory system, but a classificatory system that's ultimately going to later be used to try and surveil, police, and make sense of who these people are, when and where they're found later on, right? If we juxtapose that to contraband slave trade, that is to say that people who were imported without a license, without going through the proper inspections, without paying taxes, right? Which is also, in this contraband term I'm using very loosely and, you know, without advisement, because we know that contraband is ultimately sort of a part of the so-called legal part of slave trading as well. But the idea is people who have ultimately circumvented these legal royal processes, right? Ultimately, when they are now called to account, their slaveholders or people who are trading them are called to account, the bodies of the enslaved Africans are now going to also be inspected for proper branding, improper branding, as a way of showcasing whether or not they are actually legally entered royal subjects, right? All of this is very much at the heart of a basic question of sort of what was a slave, right? Politically, juridically, right? And what did it mean that they had certain legal possibilities in Spanish America? It certainly didn't mean that they were suddenly vassals. It certainly did not mean that masters did not have the kind of authority that we ultimately think that they had. But it does mean, or it did mean, that they were enslaved royal subjects who were now in possession of at least the right to have an audience with a royal representative, right? Who could at least take their concerns and have them heard by royal authorities, right? And this mattered to the sort of claiming of territories, it mattered to the claiming of juridical space, and it mattered to the sort of proper function of the colonial order. These things were not sort of insignificant. Now, how did enslaved Africans and their descendants develop social life, meaningful belonging, and produce a culture in Quito? And how does this example speak to the well-worn debates between African survival on the one hand versus rapid creolization on the other, right? So this is that sort of, aspect of the project that is very much about questions of diaspora and identity, or sociality and racial life, right? And that goes back to the sort of earlier clip that I made about notes on social death versus sociality. So it's important to stop for a moment and say that this very marker of slave status brought with it a particular kind of political or juridical kind of status or marker, right? To be a slave was essentially to be socially dead. I want to insist that Orlando Patterson actually has that right, and that most people are misinterpreting Patterson. And why do I say that? Along with this moniker of enslaved subject of servitude is often a sort of mention of being a cautivo, or a captive, right? Which is a kind of residue of a notion of slavery or a slave as a war captive. To be a slave legally within old Roman law was essentially to be a person who had been captured from war and yet not beheaded. In other words, someone who would have otherwise had to suffer the penalty of death, but whom the monarch had actually preserved for a particular kind of life within that order, right? So when we talk about socially dead, we have to think about this earlier scholarship coming from somebody like Claude Merceau around questions of natal alienation, right? And that's what Patterson was really talking about when we talk about social death. He was not talking about whether or not enslaved subjects could form families, remember their kin, venerate their dead properly. That's not the question. The question is not whether or not they could ultimately develop social life. The question was ultimately, what did their presence in this society connote to those who were considered to belong, who did have meaningful political association, who did have sort of political rights, right? What did the presence of an enslaved subject ultimately convey to that broader society, right? The presence of these socially dead outsiders who've now been brought in under a particular kind of juridical categorization, right? And so slavery and this question of social death, I think, is particularly important in terms of talking about political legitimacy or the ability to ultimately begin to sort of chart one's existence within that society in terms of legal possibilities and actual sort of legitimate political rights, right? So to talk about social death is to talk about the kind of predicament that enslaved Africans found themselves within, to sort of think about Vincent Brown's work. To talk about social death is to think about the kind of predicament that slavery ultimately places the enslaved within, right? that they themselves now begin to try and make sense of. And in terms of the case of Quito, we see that certainly all the things that we found in terms of questions of diaspora and identity, that these things are socially constructed, identity is, and that the ways in which people begin to have social life really depends upon time and place, right? So this question of creolization versus survival is really a sort of question that depends upon when and where we look. And so diaspora and identity would be sort of on one side, and race governance would be sort of on the other side. Which is to say that one does not ultimately preclude the other, but for all of the social life and meaning and belonging that enslaved African captives are able to ultimately develop for themselves in the face of this onslaught, they don't ultimately escape this broader sort of matrix of racial rule that they are actually a part of marking off, right? So to quote Vincent Brown, the concept of social death is ultimately out of place in the political history of slavery. if studies of slavery would account for the outlooks and maneuvers of the enslaved as an important part of that history, scholars would do better to keep in view the struggle against alienation rather than alienation itself. Right? And this would require us to pursue, he says, a subtle but significant shift in perspective from seeing slavery as a condition to viewing enslavement as a predicament in which enslaved Africans and their descendants never ceased to pursue a politics of belonging, mourning, accounting, and regeneration. Right? And I think that's absolutely true. But that doesn't ultimately say very much about racial domination itself. Right? And so therein lies the sort of tension and the sort of rub. And so over the course of the book, I look at slavery and colonial development, marking bodies, baptism, marriage, and the formation of sacred communities allows for the reading of marriage and baptismal records as a lens into how it is that people went about making community and having belonging in spite of, and sometimes through and because of, the broader sort of governing matrix that sought to limit their possibilities. And certainly in rebels, fugitives, and litigants, I look at the ways in which that sovereignty that slaves on the one hand marked off for the monarch by way of their branded bodies, their baptized bodies, they're now legally and juridically named bodies. That sovereignty was ultimately a kind of fragmented sovereignty, both in terms of the power that a master might purport to hold, but also in terms of the kind of power and authority that monarchs sought to maintain in relationship to slaveholding. So ultimately, I end with thinking about slavery in ways that say, yes, the armies of Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín, composed mainly of blacks and castas, helped to win the wars of independence. Yet even this winning did not mark the immediate or the inevitable end of racial slavery. Neither did it eradicate slavery, nor did it remove other practices of racial rule and exclusion, nor did it stem the tide of what was by then a growing and increasingly biologized ideology of race, that ideology that colonial slavery had helped to mark off and make so possible. Yes, when we consider the phrase governing through slavery, we quickly realize that this involved, quote, the actual use of power from below and from above from the 16th to the 18th centuries, end of quote. But we realize also that Quito was not a slave society because it, quote unquote, wanted to be, but because the entire Spanish colonial order that it endeavored to mark off and sustain was in fact a slave-based racial order. It was this racial residue that constituted the post-colonial racial regimes that emerged in the second half of the 19th century. After all of them proved to be entangled with the colonial legacies of race governance and Atlantic slavery. I insist that in Quito we can see slavery as a mode of governance, not because slavery predominated economically, nor because enslaved people predominated numerically, neither because the colonial state or the empire won, but rather because this is how it worked. Indeed, I would insist that Quito was not merely marginal, but rather emblematic of how colonial Spanish America functioned as seen at this level of scale. So when we think about Quito as a much smaller society overall, the numbers of inhabitants are going to be smaller, the number of Africans and enslaved Africans is much smaller. But what you have to think about and account for is that you're looking at a colonial society at a particular level of scale, right? All of the vagaries and contradictions and sort of near misses and different sort of points of departure that you find in, say, Mexico City or Lima or in Havana were present here as well. You're just looking at them at a smaller level of scale. In other words, it's our ability to focus on the inner workings of slavery at this level of scale that allows us to see slavery and its intrinsic contradictions and conflicts as a measure and critical feature of colonial rule in the Americas. Thank you. I'll take questions.
point that you made early on about how in Quito there was this denial of slavery despite the visible evidence. And I wonder to what extent that extends to the present day denial of blackness or of African descent and the evidence. To illustrate that, I just wanted to share an experience that I had in the 90s. I was working for United Airlines and sent to Argentina to on a project, and my host was very curious about me as an African American, but he said, you know, the problems that you have, we don't have those problems because we don't really have black people here, and we didn't have slavery, which I knew wasn't true, but I just listened. But then we saw these black people in different places, shopping centers, and so I said, well, what about those people? And he said, they're Brazilian. And I didn't know whether they were Brazilian or not. I didn't go up to them and ask them if they were from Brazil or if they really were from Argentina. But what interested me more was the fact that he was very committed to the idea that there weren't any black Argentinians. So I'm wondering if that, you know, kind of extends beyond slavery, and then why? I mean, why in the Latin American context does there seem to be this lack of emphasis on, or moving away from the fact that, you know, that there was slavery, that there are black people in these societies?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And for me, it's a little bit complicated to answer it, but I will say that what's interesting about that is that it reminds me of the ways in which slavery is often disavowed and forgotten and misremembered over time and across space and time, right? So if you think about the U.S. North, right, over the course of the 19th century, there's a real sort of effort to not only to not only arrive at a place where sort of broader emancipation is true in the U.S. North, but to actually actively forget slavery in the North, right? And here I'm sort of drawing on Patricia Lott's work, which really looks at the way that slavery is not just misremembered, but actively forgotten, and the ways in which its remembrance is actively suppressed in the U.S. North. So much so now that we now think of the North, right, as this sort of free space, this always already free space. And what's interesting is, you know, even a place like New Orleans, I was in the New Orleans Historic Society last year doing some research. I was actually trying to find my way to the archive. Went next door, and I spoke to a woman there, and you know, she pointed me to where the archive was. We got into a conversation about what I was working on, right? And we all know that New Orleans was an incredibly large slave port in the U.S. South, especially, you know, once sort of cotton becomes king, et cetera. And what she immediately sort of told me was like, well, you know, really, you know, Brazil was the place, right? If you really want to think about slavery, you know, it was Brazil, right? You would expect to hear these kinds of narrations in a place like Argentina or maybe in Ecuador, right? But in New Orleans, right? So there's a way in which slavery is always someplace else, right? It's never sort of right here where we're standing, right? It's always someplace else. And so your commentary about that reminds me of that. I mean, certainly over the course of the 19th century, there's a way in which concerns around race and concerns around slavery, you know, over time are sort of erased from and really sort of subdued in terms of the kind of national narratives and national mythologies that countries start to develop for themselves, right? It's part of a sort of broader campaign that I would argue is fundamentally sort of anti-black, which I didn't talk very much about, right? Questions of blackness, right? But there's a way in which we struggle within Latin American historiography, not only to talk about race, but to talk about the history of blackness, right? Because everybody's movement, everybody's mixed, everybody's, you know, arriving at some other, you know, casta designation, right? Everybody's disappearing, right, as one thing and appearing as another thing except for black folk, right? People who are marked as Negro, right? Who died as Negro and who often die as enslaved, right? So a kind of interesting question is, how do you study the history of blackness, right? Both as a kind of moniker and modality of governing people, but also as a way of self-identifying within a kind of context that valorizes mestizaje, right? That is a part of what I think is, sort of embedded in the experiences that we're talking about, right? And that conditions our ability to sort of do this work. Sure.
On the question of people of African descent in Argentina, just last week I attended a lecture at Rosenwald Hall. There was a scholar from University of Michigan who had written a book on this subject of blacks in Argentina. And she talked about the fact that in the 15th and 16th centuries, 50% of the population of Buenos Aires was of African descent. And as time progressed, and she gets up to the 18th, the 19th, and the 20th centuries, there was a deliberate policy on the part of the Argentine government to encourage European immigration and into Argentina as a way to, Europeanize the whole society. So that's, it's
Absolutely. I'm glad you did. I sort of gestured towards that, but I think that's actually far more.
But she also pointed out that a number of the people who were in Argentina, a number of the Africans who were in Argentina, who originally did come from Brazil, because Brazil was a major slave import, and they migrated to, and then they went on the Pacific coast to Chile and to other places along the Pacific coast.
Yeah, no, Buenos Aires was also a major sort of slave import in the 18th century. And some of those enslaved Africans who entered through Buenos Aires do end up on the Pacific side in Chile and in Bolivia, right? Two other places that sort of disavow this particular heritage, where a lot of really important work is being done right now about sort of slavery in Bolivia and as well as Chile, but also the sort of more contemporary histories of blackness and race in those regions as well.
And she also talked about the role that Africans played in tango. And I recall years ago seeing a film by an Argentinian who was emphasizing the role that people of African descent played in the development of tango, sort of the national dance or most popular dance in Argentina.
Certainly. Let's go here.
I was wondering if you could describe your kind of not distancing. I don't want to say if that's not what you wanted to do, but kind of your explanation of why you chose racial governance over conversations regarding racism. How you see the kind of two conceptions related and also different, and why racial governance was useful in your work and not racism. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so on the one hand, while I don't think that the term race or race governance is anachronistic, I mean, you wouldn't find it in the 17th century. It's certainly a sort of contemporary conceptualization. But what it allows us to do is sort of to trace a history of practices and attempts to govern people in very particular ways, right? Racism, has a different, more recent history, right? The concept itself is a very recent one, right? Late 19th, early 20th century, people are starting to sort of innovate a concept of racism, right? So racism as a concept has a very different history than this history of race, right? And I think one actually occasions the possibility of the other, right? And I found the notion of race governance drawn upon the political theorist Barnard Hesse's work as particularly useful as something that I can actually sort of measure and chart that would actually help me to conceptualize what I thought I was seeing in the historical record, right? So there's a way in which we can, and to ultimately talk about what Doug Cope conceptualized as racial domination, right? So I felt as though the attempt to make sense of movement fluidity, the attempt to make sense of how people self-identified had ultimately obscured, right, our understanding of the colonial order as thoroughly racialized, right? As something that was ultimately imposing and delimiting a set of possibilities for sort of self-realization and self-imagining, right? The movement notwithstanding. So I found that to be more useful as a kind of conceptual device, and certainly in terms of sort of something that comported itself well with the actual sort of archival records that I was working through, right? So, you know, it could ultimately allow me to sort of situate myself at the intersection of both theory and history, right? As a kind of, to look at practice as opposed to ideology, right? Or thinking. And I feel like racism is very much laden in questions of intention, questions of thinking, questions of thought, ideology, right? And so we get sort of trapped in that, even in our discussions right now. You know, was that racism, right? That's less interesting to me than thinking about the actual sort of practices and those practices as sustained, right, over time, and what that adds up to in terms of sort of conditioning possibilities for thinking, right? How do you get to the 19th century and where you have these ideas about race that are thoroughly biologized, that are fixed to bodies now, if you don't account for the history of practices that ultimately inscribe them upon people and landscape, right? It also allowed me to get away from thinking purely about bodies, but to also think about territory, right? Because installing enslaved African black subjects in particular territories allowed Spanish authorities to begin to try and claim those territories, and they begin to also try and govern and adjudicate matters within those territories, right? So it's about trying to get out of the trick bag that I think ideology can just, you know, contains us within, keeps us within.
So thank you so much. I'm going to ask a question that is a little unfair because it seems like it's towards the tail end. But what happened, so with governance, what happens in the 18th century? Is this, you've talked about a sustained practice over time, but does the practice change? What's the big, you know, division between race governance and when you can, you cited that when you can actually start talking about race?
Well, I mean, to be honest, no, I don't think that the 18th century means the end of race governance. I think that in the 18th century, you continue to see, you know, an attempt to govern people racially, right? The sort of gracias a sacar and the sort of proliferation of that is an excellent example of, you know, of an attempt to continue to govern people racially, even while giving people the ability to buy certification of whiteness. You're still further inscribing a kind of racial regime that ultimately authorizes life and authorizes certain possibilities, right? To enter certain ranks in the military, to enter university, right? To be a kind of colonial subject with proper standing at the end of the 18th century is all threaded through this and very much still a subject of colonial rule, right? If anything, I think you see the sort of culmination of these kinds of concerns in the 18th century. They don't stop in the 19th century either. That's actually my point. My point is that, you know, they don't stop because you see so-called Negro and Pardo armies ultimately winning Latin America or Spanish America from Spain, right? Racial rule doesn't end there, right? It even conditions the very discussion of what a citizen is going to be in, say, Venezuela or Colombia, right? Thinking about, you know, Marissa Lasso's work, for example, right? That I see all of this is playing out there, right? Or if you think about, say, David Sartorius' work on 19th century Cuba, which is looking at the ways in which people, you know, want to belong, right? The extent to which people claim a certain sort of, you know, faithfulness, right? It's a thoroughly sort of racialized kind of concern, which is related to governance and standing and political possibilities, right? But certainly, I think the difference is, I think what people are saying, right, is that by the 18th and the 19th century, you have thoroughly biologized notions or increasingly biologized notions of race, right? A concept of blood that's not about religious lineage anymore, right? You have these kinds of ideas that are really beginning to take hold in the 18th and certainly by the 19th century. And those who see race as being about fixity and blood in very contemporary ways, that seems to be satisfactory for them, right? And that's the moment when they think that we can begin to talk about race, right? I think that what we're talking about is the sort of history that ultimately culminates in that moment, right?
So I'll ask them that on the other end, when does it start? The practice, is this something that in your is brought from Spain, and so the origins of this practice of racial governance? Is it something that emerges in the combination of the New World, or is it something that is adopted and trace the lineage back from the Iberian Peninsula? Because I'm sort of asking the question about change over time.
Right, I get it. I get the question. Did race governance occur or exist in, say, 15th century Iberia, right? I do think that there's something really important about 15th century Iberian legal practice and the kinds of changes that are occurring, both in terms of how slavery is increasingly applied to sub-Saharan Africans after, say, 1450. The shift in terms of the treatment of Muslims and Jews in Iberia, forcible baptism, and an increasing sort of, to draw on Maria Elena Martinez's work, an increasing sort of preoccupation with blood lineage, right? I don't think we know to what extent that is the case yet, right? So, again, I'm not interested in saying that there are these pre-Colombian sort of Iberian roots of racism, but I do think that it's important to look at legal practice in 15th century Iberia and look at how that has changed and innovated when applied to the Americas, right? Because I'm interested in territory, and when applied to sub-Saharan Africa, right? Not just the Americas, right? Because it's through this practice of slaving and slave trading with sub-Saharan Africans increasingly, and that's not all that Iberians are doing, right? We know that there are certain sort of diplomatic relationships between the Portuguese and the Congo, for example. But this increasing relationship to sub-Saharan Africa through slavery and slaving, I think, marks that territory in very particularized or racialized ways, right? So for me, it's no coincidence that after the cessation of the transatlantic slave trade, you have the scramble for Africa. You have sort of European colonization, dispossession, outright dispossession of African landscapes. Not just because militarily or tactically it's possible now, right? But because that has been inscribed upon that sort of terrain as a legitimate juridical concourse of action, right? I mean, that's sort of how I think about it. But those antecedents matter. But I do think that there's something about the Americas and the development of these three categories, Indio, Negro, and Espanol, after, say, 1492, that's particularly useful in charting that history of early modern race governance. Is that
Thank you.
answer? All right. But that's all I know. No. Yes.
Go ahead. I just, why early kind of racial governance? I know there's a lot of research out there about like how racism, racial governance work now and have worked. For instance, the census, I mean, Mexico just barely did one regarding black individuals in Mexico. So I'm kind of wondering what you see as the utility, and I'm not saying that it's not useful, I'm wondering, I want you to explain it for me, like what is the utility of looking at well, not industrial, like pre-modern, if you will, kind of colonial racial governance. Why that period?
Well, I think in some ways to talk about this as early modern, right, is to talk about the modern as racialized, right, from its inception. It's always already sort of grounded in racial. immigration, right? It's constituted through these racial practices, right? So when you begin to see the modern as already racialized, right, you're not asking these questions about the sort of move to racial slavery, right? Its application in the Americas is already racial, right? And I think that's very important. The other thing that I think is really important is that it conditions or starts the story with people of African descent and indigenous descent already as a part of it, right? It also, for me, serves to sort of upset or to showcase the ways in which certain terms are rather redundant. So for me to say something like slavery and colonialism, or colonialism and race, or slavery and race, those are sort of redundancies, right? And I think that's the takeaway, and that's the importance of this work in some ways, right? To show the ways in which slavery and racial domination are deeply embedded in conquest and colonization right from the get-go, right? And that's not necessarily accepted wisdom at this point in time. So I think it's worth sort of staking that out. And because there are these questions that persist, like sort of when did race begin, right? It is an attempt to try and address that question, even if I'm not, sort of definitively saying it's the 16th century, but it's mostly the 16th century.
Yeah, I'd like to just follow up on that question of people of African descent in Argentina. The lecture I attended, I was looking through my notes, and there were a couple of books that she referenced. And one was entitled Tango, An Art History of Love by Professor Robert Ferris Thompson, who I think is a professor at Princeton University. And then the other one was a general sense, just a sort of general history of blacks in Argentina. So I looked through my notes and I can't find it. So
all right, thank you. Excellent.
Can you talk a little bit about like self-identification and like the mestiza and the hierarchy of race? I guess my question is like, how much power did people have to self-identify if we know that a lot of like racial governance was like sought through the like white gaze or the European gaze, right?
Well, I think that this question of identity is certainly a very sort of vexed one, right? I mean, because so often the sources that we have are these sources that are produced by one colonial authority or another, right? So the best thing that we can say is there's certain sort of ruptures in history where we see people expressing a particular kind of sort of identity or self-identification. I think when you think about identity in that sense, right, I think it's deeply personal. I think it's deeply localized. I think it's certainly situated, and I think that is certainly socially constructed, right? That's different from race as a kind of colonial imposition, right? So people have a lot of power, I think, in some ways, and a lot of agency, right? People are saying like, oh, you're giving all the agency to the colonial authorities. No, not at all, right? I just actually won't let us forget the way that people's possibility for agency or their attempts to self-identify are conditioned upon that, right? And the ways in which even when they do, like even when you see, a wedding party of people who are all supposedly from the Greater Congo, and they come and they say, I am Juan de Congo and this is Maria, and these are our witnesses who have come to help us legitimize our marriage, right? What you're looking at are this kind of group of people who, in order to receive this sort of legitimacy, have to comport and represent themselves in relationship to that broader sort of taxonomy that's been imposed upon them, right? That doesn't mean that suddenly their marriage is legitimate in ways that it wasn't before to them, right? It doesn't mean that we know what these monikers Congo means to them, right? It doesn't mean that they haven't worked that out amongst themselves, right? Or even with their children, right? We just sort of know what we can see, right? An interesting example of that is sort of what do we make of the children of this sort of Congo family, if you will, right? Do they speak Kikongo? Do they also speak Spanish? What is their experience? How do they relate to them, right? These are sort of, you know, basic questions of identity and the ways that those identities sort of change over time. So I think that's how I would respond to that. I think people have, if we're talking about identity as something that's deeply personal, local, and socially constructed, and something that sort of shifts depending upon when and where we look at somebody, then there's a lot of possibility and power in that, right? It's not obvious or inevitable.
I was wondering if you could comment on the relationship, if any, that you see between race governance and contraband. So is contraband merely a reaction against race governance? Does it challenge or undermine race governance by providing kind of another means by which, for instance, enslaved individuals are introduced into colonial society?
Okay. I think it's important for me to explain what I mean by contraband in order for you to answer that question. So when I'm talking about contraband, slave trading, I'm merely talking about smugglers who did not go by the way of the legal authorities. So their slaves were not registered, they did not pay taxes on these slaves, and their slaves probably did not receive the royal sort of actual brand, right? Or sometimes they were a part of an arriving group that was registered and the taxes had been paid. But the person bringing in the group of enslaved captives said they had 100 when they had 150, right? And they paid taxes on it, right? And so somehow those others were smuggled to their ultimate sort of location and destination, right? This is where sort of colonial authorities are essentially seeking to get the taxes that are ultimately owed to the royal coffers, right? Where they're ultimately trying to get a hold of sort of what's happening, right? And to also sometimes just enrich themselves, right? So this isn't all sort of neat and clean or sort of, you know, precise, right? This is all actually, I think, an embedded part of the legal economy, if you will, right? So what does one have to do with the other in terms of what does this have to do with race governance? Well, I think it allows you to see, in some ways, an attempt to mark and surveil bodies in a particular way, right? I think that's an important sort of connection back to race governance, right? That the body as a kind of site of inscription and as a kind of text that must be sort of inspected and read, right? And certain bodies being inspected and read in certain ways and circulating within society in certain ways, right? And what that ultimately says to other individuals within society, right? So again, it's sort of what is the role of an enslaved person within the sort of broader orbit of the social sphere? What does hearing, you know, slave bells or shackles or seeing an enslaved body or seeing the royal brand confer to or suggest to people who don't occupy that status within society, right? So it's an attempt to try and ask the reader or ask scholars to think about the social and the political meaning of slavery beyond numbers and economics, right? To think about that social and political, what sort of majesty and power does this ultimately suggest or thwart?
To what extent would you say you see race governance today?
Oh, I think it's. I think we see it all the time. I think that what you're looking at in terms of sort of policing is a clear example of racial governance and racial rule. The ways that certain people are marked and surveilled, the way that certain people are worthy of death and likely to die, the way that certain people circulate as felons, right? And the way that their possibilities and conditions of life are delimited, right, in spite of and right alongside the presence of, you know, others who escape that, right? Say our president, right, and who ultimately don't quite escape that. right, at the same time. Right? So I think that's a perfect example. I think, you know, some of what we've been talking about on our campuses is also an example of sort of racial rule. The ways in which certain people are called to comport themselves in certain ways is a sort of example of racial rule or racial governance, right? It's an attempt to govern people in a particular sort of way. And that's actually part of the reason why it's more interesting to me to talk about these practices of racial violence, exclusion, these things, as opposed to us getting into the trick bag of what's this racism, right? What was intended, right? You usually hear these kinds of absurd questions after something happens, right? You know, well, was the officer thinking about this person's race? That's not so interesting to me. What's interesting to me is the sort of repetition of a particular kind of violence upon particular bodies in society over and over again, right? The practices are what's interesting here, right? So the fetters, the brands, right, being compelled to labor in certain ways or being adorned in certain ways, right? All of that is a part of that sort of racial governance that's being imposed, that sort of imposition, right? Deeming somebody something and ruling them in relationship to that.
The example that you gave about the Congo wedding stimulated a question in my mind, and I'm trying to think how to articulate it. So, at some point when I was traveling in Jamaica, I met these so-called Maroons who identified themselves as Coromanti, or Cromanti, which doesn't really exist. There's no such thing as an ethnic group called Coromanti. In Africa, it was a slave castle, as I understand it. So you mentioned that the part of the process of policing slavery indicated that there was a fleeting awareness, correct me if I'm misquoting you, of the nations of origins of enslaved people, but sometimes it was inaccurate. Is that kind of what you were suggesting?
Well, I think there's certainly a limitation on what slave traders knew about sort of how it is that individuals themselves identify. I think, as you point out, sometimes that had to do with where they were purchased. Sometimes that had to do with from whom they were purchased. Sometimes that had to do with, you know, roughly marking off some sort of expanse of territory where people were likely from, right? But these were ultimately rather imprecise. And to the extent that they had meaning, this meaning was also sort of constructed over time, right? It was something that was ultimately worked out in tension with authorities' attempt to rule people as such, and those individuals' attempts to try and make sense of their lives in relationship to those categorizations.
Well, the question that interests me is to what extent were people likely to internalize these sometimes inaccurate identifications, like the example of the Cromanti. And they have this whole kind of system of categorization about themselves as Cromanti, which isn't really, you know, like we're brave and we're warriors. And I guess it's kind of true, the Maroons were warriors. But it was interesting to me the way that this identity that was kind of created was internalized. And I'm wondering if that was a common sort of thing, you know, like you're deemed, you know, whatever. And, you know, you may be from Congo or someplace else. But I guess if it was ever useful to accept and internalize those sort of externally imposed modes of identifying, was there ever any advantage to it?
Well, I think in some cases there might have been an advantage to it. I think that the example that I gave, there's certainly an advantage to identifying oneself in this way when you're before a priest trying to get a marriage authenticated, in part because the colonial practice demands that to some extent and rewards it to some extent. What that means about what people truly internalize is a different and I think much more vexed sort of question. And I think it's also worth saying that it's not always colonial authorities who are stating these, giving these monikers out, right? Sometimes this is influenced by, other individuals. Sometimes this is influenced by Africans themselves. Sometimes this is influenced by interpreters and translators and people from some of these regions, right? But oftentimes when you're looking at just a sort of, a sort of bill of sale or a sort of importation records, that's produced through a different kind of process, right? It's not necessarily produced with all these other voices. So that's a very difficult kind of question to answer, and I think it's a whole sort of ongoing scholarly literature and debate that's very much about this question of what people do with identity, or how it is that people form identity, right? So, yes.
So I have a follow-up question to Dr. Ray about how you see racial governance being operated, and in particular in relation to this system of surveillance and marking or anything this question. I'm trying to imagine how you locate power in the system. And you mentioned how racial governance in the past, there was this colonial case that described these markings of the police. I'm trying to imagine the analogy to the case today. But it seems to be kind of like case from nowhere, and I can't identify that kind of the same kind of case that you're talking about.
A gaze from nowhere. Well, I don't know. I would think about it as on the one hand, Western. I think about it on the other hand as one that is coming from a range of governing bodies, not always simply the state. I think there are a number of ways to think about sort of where that gaze is sort of coming from, right? Is it coming from neighbors, in particularly predominantly white community? Is it coming from people who aren't necessarily white and in their input? So there's this gaze from nowhere is interesting. It's a sort of interesting concept. I hadn't quite considered it that way, but I think it will be interesting to see how you might operationalize that.
Because I think the problem with this idea of the gaze from nowhere is that it somehow becomes something that can represent people, at the same time it avoids being represented. And so if you want to unmake the system of surveillance and undo your power, if you can't locate where the gaze is, then you can't sort of resist at all. So that's why I was asking if it's possible to trace this, where this power is coming from.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's kind of a general question, like to what extent do you believe the writings and the research done on slavery in Latin America like give a comprehensive understanding of the real slavery?
To what extent do the writings on slavery in Latin America give a real account of slavery, of a real slavery? Well, I mean, I think there's certainly a lot of work that's been done that's very, very good. There's a very broad sort of historiography of slavery in Latin America. In some places less so than others. And I do think that a lot of it is certainly very valid and very useful, right? It's deeply empirical, to say the least. And I think that we're at a place now where we can begin to try and theorize and conceptualize what this means for how we understand Latin American societies and social order, right? So there's a lot of research that's on the table now that shows us the sort of variety and the various permutations of slavery across time, right? And I think that's actually the sort of issue, right? There is no sort of one sort of application or reality of slavery, whether you're talking about Quito or Mexico City or New York City or Charleston, right? It sort of depends on where you look and when. I do think that that given the sources that we have, there's a lot more work to be done across these geographies. think that's very much in process. Right.
I want to thank Professor Bryant so much.